There are moments so absurd, so completely disconnected from reality, that when they happen to you, you almost want to laugh. Almost. I was sitting on the bank of my lake on a quiet Tuesday morning, rod in hand, watching the water move the way it always moves when the wind comes through the trees at that particular angle, peaceful and unhurried and exactly the way my father taught me to appreciate it. I had been fishing that lake since I was 4 years old. My father fished it before me and his mother fished it before him. 3 generations of my family had sat on that bank watching that water and feeling the particular stillness that only comes from being somewhere that belongs to you in a way that goes deeper than any piece of paper. And then 2 police officers walked down the embankment toward me and told me I was trespassing on private property and needed to leave immediately or face arrest. I looked up at them from my folding chair, rod still in hand, and felt something shift inside me that has never fully shifted back. Not anger exactly. Something quieter and more permanent than anger. The complete and absolute certainty that what was about to unfold was going to cost someone a very great deal. If this story speaks to something in you, if you believe that truth eventually finds its way to the surface no matter how long it takes, please take a moment right now to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear a story about patience and justice and what happens when the wrong people push the wrong person too far. Leave us a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from tonight. We read every single comment on this channel and your location means more to us than you know. And if you have not yet subscribed to Karen's Stories Daily, please do it now, because this community was built for people who believe that doing things the right way, even when it is hard, even when it takes longer than it should, is always worth it in the end. Now let me take you all the way back to where this story truly begins, because to understand what happened on that Tuesday morning by the lake you need to understand what that lake is, where it came from, and what it has meant to one family across 3 generations of quiet and unassuming stewardship. My grandmother Celestine acquired the property in the early 1960s. She was a woman of remarkable practical intelligence who had grown up with very little and had spent her adult life making careful decisions that compounded slowly into something significant. The property she purchased was substantial. 47 acres of mixed woodland and open land on the edge of what was then a sparsely populated rural area. At the center of those 47 acres sat a natural freshwater lake of approximately 9 acres. Celestine had fallen in love with that lake the first time the real estate agent drove her out to see the property. She told my father years later that she knew before she had even gotten out of the car that she was going to buy it and that she was going to keep it forever. She kept it. She raised my father on that land, teaching him the rhythms of it the way people who truly know a piece of earth teach their children. Which trees to watch for the first signs of spring. Which corner of the lake held the best fish in the early morning. How the water changed color in different seasons and what those changes meant about the ecosystem beneath the surface. My father absorbed all of it and added his own knowledge over the decades, and when Celestine passed and the property came to him, he continued the stewardship with the same quiet devotion she had shown. I grew up on that land the way my father had grown up on it. The lake was not a recreational feature to us. It was a living presence that we had a relationship with. We managed it carefully, monitored the wildlife, maintained the water quality, and treated it with the kind of respect that comes from understanding that you are not really an owner in the deepest sense but a temporary guardian of something that will outlast you by centuries if you treat it properly. When my father passed, the property came to me. Along with it came every document Celestine had accumulated since the original purchase, every survey, every tax record, every maintenance log, every piece of correspondence with county authorities about the land and the lake. My father had added to that collection throughout his own stewardship, and I had continued the practice. The documentation of our ownership and our relationship with that property was comprehensive, organized, and unambiguous. The area around our land had changed dramatically over the decades. What had been sparse rural territory when Celestine made her purchase was now a developed residential community with several hundred homes, manicured streets, a community center, and an active HOA that managed neighborhood affairs with considerable energy and ambition. The development had grown up around and adjacent to our property over the years, and the lake, visible from certain points in the neighborhood and known to residents as the lake on the hill, had become part of the landscape that people associated with the area without necessarily knowing or thinking about who owned it. This misunderstanding, casual and unexamined, had been building for years without my full awareness. Residents who walked near the property boundary could see the lake through the tree line. They talked about it at community meetings as a local natural feature. The HOA, in its newsletters and community communications, had begun referring to it in language that implied a public or community character it had never actually possessed. Not through any deliberate deception exactly, but through the accumulated assumption of people who had been looking at something beautiful for long enough that they had begun to feel a kind of ownership over it simply through proximity and familiarity. I had noticed some of this language in HOA materials that occasionally came to my attention and had sent a letter to the board clarifying the lake's private status about 2 years before the Tuesday morning that changed everything. The letter was professional and clear. It explained that the lake and all surrounding land was privately owned, that it appeared on county records in my name, and that any community communications describing it as a neighborhood feature needed to be corrected. I received a brief acknowledgement from the board secretary and assumed the matter had been noted and would be addressed. It had not been adequately addressed. What I did not know was that the HOA had continued using the lake as a background feature in their marketing materials for the neighborhood, had included it in a community amenities brochure distributed to prospective buyers, and had allowed the assumption of semi-public access to persist and deepen in the minds of residents who had never been given accurate information about the lake's ownership. The new HOA board that took office 8 months before that Tuesday morning had inherited all of these assumptions without inheriting any awareness of my letter or the clarification I had provided. Among the new board members was a woman named Theodora who had moved into the subdivision 2 years earlier, had become deeply invested in HOA affairs, and had appointed herself the informal guardian of community standards and community resources. Theodora was the kind of person who confused enthusiasm with authority and who had a particular talent for organizing other people around a cause before fully examining whether the cause was valid. Theodora had seen me walking down to the lake on previous occasions and had decided, without checking any records, without consulting the county, without reviewing the HOA's own files for my previous correspondence, that I was a trespasser using a community resource without authorization. She had raised the matter at a board meeting, presented her concern with the confidence of someone who had already decided they were right, and the board had agreed that the situation needed to be addressed. The decision was made to contact local law enforcement and report an unauthorized individual regularly accessing what the board believed was a community lake. Nobody on that board checked the county property records before making that call. Nobody reviewed the HOA files for my previous letter. Nobody asked a single question about who actually owned the lake before dispatching 2 police officers down the embankment toward a man sitting quietly in a folding chair fishing a lake his grandmother had purchased 60 years ago. The officers were professional and courteous when they approached me. They explained that they had received a report of unauthorized access to private property and asked me to identify myself and explain my presence at the lake. I told them my name calmly and clearly. I told them that the lake was my private property and had been my family's private property for 60 years. I told them that I had documentation proving ownership available at my home a short walk from where we were sitting and offered to show it to them immediately. One of the officers asked me to wait while he ran my name through the system. What came back confirmed everything I had told them. The property, including the lake, was registered in my name with the county. The tax records showed continuous family ownership going back to Celestine's original purchase. There was no ambiguity and no complexity. The officers apologized for the interruption, explained that they had been responding to a call made in good faith, and left me to my fishing with expressions that suggested they had a fairly clear picture of what had actually happened. I sat by the lake for another hour after they left. I watched the water. I thought about Celestine and the way she had described knowing this was her place before she even got out of the car. I thought about my father teaching me which corner held the best fish in the morning. And I thought about the phone call I was going to make when I got home. My attorney listened to the full account without interrupting. When I finished he was quiet for a moment and then he said something I have thought about many times since. He said that what the HOA had done was not simply an embarrassing mistake. It was the visible surface of something much larger. A pattern of conduct that included misrepresenting the lake in community materials, using it in marketing for the subdivision, ignoring my previous correspondence clarifying its private status, and ultimately directing law enforcement to remove a property owner from their own land. Each element individually was significant. Together they represented a course of conduct with serious legal consequences. The investigation that followed over the subsequent months was thorough and revealing. My attorney and a team he assembled went through every HOA newsletter, every community brochure, every marketing material for the subdivision that had referenced the lake. They documented every instance where it had been described as a community amenity or neighborhood feature. They located the prospective buyer brochures that included the lake in the list of neighborhood attractions. They found email communications between board members discussing the lake as a community resource. And they found, buried in the HOA files that were produced during discovery, my original letter from 2 years earlier and a brief internal note confirming it had been received and, critically, the decision that had been made not to correct the community communications or inform new board members of the ownership clarification I had provided. That internal note changed the character of the entire case. It transformed what might have been characterized as an honest mistake into documented evidence of a decision to continue a misrepresentation after being formally notified that it was inaccurate. The legal implications of that distinction were substantial. The civil case that followed addressed multiple categories of harm. There was the direct harm of having law enforcement called on me while on my own property, documented humiliation and distress that any reasonable person would understand required remedy. There was the commercial harm from years of the lake being used in subdivision marketing materials without my consent, effectively leveraging my private property to sell homes in their community and increase property values without any compensation or authorization from me. There was the ongoing harm from the misrepresentation of the lake's status to hundreds of residents who had been given false information about what the neighborhood offered. And there was the specific harm from the decision to ignore my correspondence and continue the misrepresentation rather than correct it. The HOA's insurance carrier became involved early in the proceedings. Their attorneys understood quickly that the documentation my legal team had assembled presented a comprehensive and difficult-to-refute picture of institutional misrepresentation sustained over years. The internal note about my original letter was particularly damaging because it removed the defense of innocent mistake from the most significant elements of the claim. The negotiation process was extended and at times difficult. The HOA board members who had authorized the police call were individually defensive in ways that slowed the process. There were attempts to reframe the narrative, to suggest that the lake's visibility from the neighborhood created some kind of community interest in it, to argue that the marketing materials had been innocent descriptions of the area's natural features rather than misrepresentations of ownership. Each of these arguments was addressed systematically and specifically by my legal team with documentation that left very little room for alternative interpretation. The settlement that was eventually reached totaled $6.8 million. The figure reflected the commercial value of years of unauthorized use of my property in subdivision marketing, the harm from the police incident and the pattern of conduct that led to it, legal costs, and additional damages that the evidence supported. It was not a number I had fixed on at the beginning of the process. It was a number that emerged from a careful and comprehensive accounting of what had actually occurred and what the documentation supported. Theodora resigned from the HOA board before the settlement was finalized. The full board underwent significant changes in the period that followed, with several members choosing not to seek re-election. The new board, in one of their first formal actions, sent me a written acknowledgement that the lake was private property, committed to correcting all community communications that had misrepresented its status, and established a formal policy requiring legal review of any community materials before publication. The brochures that had included the lake as a neighborhood amenity were recalled and corrected. The HOA website was updated. A notice was sent to all subdivision residents clarifying the lake's private ownership status and formally correcting years of inaccurate community communications. I used a portion of the settlement to establish a conservation agreement for the lake and the surrounding land, working with a local land trust to create formal protections ensuring the ecosystem would be maintained properly in perpetuity. Celestine had loved that lake from the moment she saw it through a car window 60 years ago. The conservation agreement felt like the right way to honor what she had started and what my father had continued. I still fish the lake every Tuesday morning when the weather allows. I still sit in the same folding chair my father used when he taught me which corner holds the best fish in the early hours. The water still moves the way it always moves when the wind comes through the trees at that particular angle, peaceful and unhurried and completely unchanged by everything that happened around it. What I want you to understand from this story is something that goes beyond property rights and legal settlements. It is about what happens when institutions make assumptions instead of asking questions. When organizations treat proximity as ownership and familiarity as entitlement. When one letter of clarification gets filed away instead of acted upon because acting upon it would have required admitting something inconvenient. My grandmother bought that lake because she knew it was hers before she even stepped out of the car. She kept it because she understood that some things are worth protecting not for what they are worth in money but for what they mean in time. 3 generations of my family had cared for that water and those trees and that particular stillness that settles over the bank in the early morning before the world gets loud. No assumption, no brochure, no police call, and no misunderstanding could change what that lake was. It just took a Tuesday morning and 2 officers walking down an embankment for the full truth of it to finally surface. And now it is protected. Legally, permanently, and with the kind of documentation that ensures no one will ever have to sit on that bank and explain its ownership again. If this story reached something inside you today, if it made you feel something real about patience and legacy and the quiet power of knowing what is yours and standing firm in that knowledge, please like this video right now and share it with someone in your life who needs to hear it. This channel exists because of people like you who believe these stories matter and who take the time to pass them on. Before you go, I want to ask you to do one thing. Leave one word in the comments below. Just one word that describes how this story made you feel. One word. That is all. Because sometimes one word says everything that needs to be said, and I want to know what this story stirred in you. Subscribe to Karen's Stories Daily if you have not already. And thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for watching until the very end. Stories like this one only reach the people who need them because of viewers like you who stay, who share, and who believe that truth and patience will always outlast everything that tries to stand against them.